What is wrong with Sage? Actually, not that much, but what is wrong, quote unquote, just stands out really hard when it does stand out. Sage highlights incredibly well the problem inherent in giving all jobs of a specific category the same skeleton of options, because it just makes the few differences each job in a category gets that much clearer. And if just one tool happens to be particularly effective, that alone can completely overshadow the alternative. So what exactly is it that is so wrong with Sage? Let's start with some positives. Sage is, by and large, Scholar's more modern and more streamlined sibling. It does not have to deal with pet jank. Even if pet jank has been reduced quite a lot over the years, it is still here. Sage also does not have to deal with the weird sort of anti-synergy that Scholar deals with, where certain cooldowns log it out of others and so on. Sage also does not need to have to worry about optimizing things like energy drain due to not having it, and fights offensively similarly to a selfish DPS, playing into raid buffs rather than providing one. Cardia also means that where Sage has full control over where their automated heals go, Scholar has to contend with the whims of whoever their fairy chooses to heal, when that matters. And, in a similar fashion, also simply slams Karakoli for mitigation, where Scholar has to sort of place its, albeit gigantic dome, may have to think about set placement at times. Sage also has less strict options compared to Scholar, where it can sort of mix and match cooldowns as needed, whereas Scholar might feel more like it has specific batches to work with. On average, Sage also has significantly better MP management due to the refunds induced by Adder Stings, and far better mobility thanks to both the application of shields, as well as set Adder Stings enabling further movement at no cost, and let's not forget Icarus. Sage also has, theoretically, the biggest possible shield available in Euphrasia Diagnosis. I have a separate video on this. And possibly the biggest, asterisk, party shield on top of that in Panheimer. Sage is doing well for itself, and it sounds amazing when we really hype it up, and when it comes to nearly all content, Sage can do what Scholar can do, seemingly with less effort. But what exactly is the problem then? Competing with the strongest job in Final Fantasy XIV, even when it's been at its weakest, weirdest, and dankest and jankiest moments, Scholar has always been such an overwhelming force in the game thanks to whatever tools it ended up with in its toolbox that it would be difficult to argue that a party wouldn't be improved by its presence. Whether it was in the old days where it had access to a party-wide Ishuna, the times where crit Atlos provided just one shield so you could deploy that monster on the whole party, the more modern times where the shield was perhaps smaller but consistently attainable with recitation, or with Expedient giving Scholar the only party sprint, or indeed Dawntrail, where they allowed Scholar to effectively turn into the ultimate pure healer for 20 seconds, because why not? To compete with all of that, Sage was given a lot of almost identical actions. In some cases, easier to use versions too. As a result, when it comes to Sage's weakness compared to Scholar, it really comes down to a very select few things that don't matter in nearly all content and nearly all situations. But if, for instance, you watched the Kefka Ultimate race and thought, where are the Sages at? Then this might just explain why. Take, for instance, Panheimer, representing one of the biggest party barriers on its own, cumulatively. Now, a barrier that softens 6 hits in a row is nothing to scoff at. The problem is that if the damage holding you back is split over 6 hits, there are a lot of ways to handle that kind of damage, including healing in between hits, multiple barriers, and whatnot, meaning that while it is an incredibly useful button to have, it makes it easier to deal with, especially, in particular, a very specific shape of damage. And A lot of the time, hard content smacks you with one big hit, and if Panheimer is used for that, it mostly goes to healing at half power. By comparison, a Scholar can guarantee a crit at Loquium to deploy more frequently than a Sage has access to Panheimer. Granted, the Panheimer can be supported by a Zoe-boosted E-proc, but it still doesn't quite stand up to the sheer consistency of an Atlo deploy. And yes, I am aware that Panheimer is supposed to be comparable to Summon Seraph, but Panheimer sort of represents the strongest comparable tool to Atlo deploy that Sage has regular access to. That isn't the same as what Scholar has too. Now, in a more realistic scenario, Sage is a bit more spammy with cooldowns, similar to Astrologian, while Scholar is more precise, like White Mage. And indeed, an advantage that Sage has over Scholar is more different sources of barriers and whatnot. So if you need a little something something for an attack, Sage can almost always provide it, and back it up with an E-proc due to how fast that comes out. Another example that can vary heavily in how significant it even is to begin with is that Sage is simply worse at healing when it is forced to stop attacking. To be specific, while Eos's Embrace is distinctly weaker and slower than Cardia at full blast, Eos doesn't stop casting Embrace when things get dicey. On the other hand, once the Sage starts focusing on healing spells when things are going sideways, the Cardia healing stops entirely. Another example of this is that Scholar's Consultation heals for twice as much as E-proc, meaning every time Scholar decides to put up a normal party shield when deploy isn't available, it heals more, assuming the healing is needed or helpful. Yes, Sage has the option to use regular prognosis to heal more, but when it comes to harder content where these kinds of nitpicky comparisons matter in the first place, if they even do there, that might be a death sentence of its own. Similarly, unless you time Pepsis perfectly so you get both the barrier value and the healing value, it is objectively worse than emergency tactics. I think, oddly, the most accurate way to compare these two is that Sage works better when things are going well already. Like, it makes a decent victory into a great one. Scholar, on the other hand, is a bit more capable of pulling out unexpectedly impressive results to turn a potential loss into maybe a victory at all. To be clear, I said more capable. It's not like Sage can't also do that. Scholar is just a little better at it. I think a particular pair of actions perfectly encapsulates this comparison: Philosophia and Seraphism. In a winning situation, Philosophia can produce around 8 to 9 party heals worth 150 potency, so around 1350, by simply constantly attacking. For comparison, Seraphism in a winning situation will only produce somewhere around 700 to 800 potency of healing from the passive aura. So in any situation where you just need some more healing, Philosophia is way stronger. On the other hand, in the same scenario, but spamming party heals, a Sage could constantly spam Prognosis, being almost completely mobile, but this could, when combined with the Philosophia healing itself, add up to over 4,000 cure potency combined per person. Yes, you could E-proc Pepsis once as well. For comparison, due to Seraphism effectively removing the cooldown on emergency tactics and removing the cast with Accession, the Scholar can spam both of these options to produce healing upwards of 6,000 cure potency. Realistically, you probably won't need that much in either case, but the fact that Sage wins so decisively in a more mundane situation, while Scholar wins so wildly in a more extreme situation, really helps to underline what it is that makes Scholar so difficult to beat. This problem, quote-unquote, that Sage is more focused on an even performance in any situation, while Scholar seems to be capable of transforming into the craziest monster for whatever it is you need, barriers usually, tends to specifically come up in the context of proccing Savage or ultimates. And where Savage often allows Sage to gradually catch up or even take over in popularity since the gear turns what was a hectic heal check for fight into something more manageable. Ultimates don't really do that in the same way. That doesn't mean Sage cannot do ultimates or that they need gear to function in Savage, but as I said before, if you ever wondered why Sage is much less represented among the best teams in the world, it is simply because Scholar is slightly better at the healer adjust thing than Sage. And the things that Sage uniquely brings to the table over Scholar are things that can often be fixed in post, as it were. If the party needs more damage output to meet a check, and that damage has to come from healers for some reason, well, then you'll figure that out when you get there. And you do that whether you had a Scholar or a Sage. I guess it is also worth mentioning that Scholar having some of its damage potential stored in Chain Stratagem also means that focusing in on healing more is less costly on the damage for Scholar than it is for Sage. But as far as the data I can find suggests, this isn't really a factor when picking between Sage or Scholar for parties, outside of passing groups, I'd say. Now, what is very interesting about this comparison, where it feels like Sage is somehow completely inferior to its counterpart Scholar due to just a select few rather small differences, is not unique to barrier healers, or even healers in general, but is something that isn't really a problem for most parties in most content. Essentially, if two jobs of the same category, for example barrier healers, are 95% identical in their defensive toolkit, then whichever one has the better or more widely applicable unique 5% is going to be considered better in whatever content where the difference matters at all. But when it comes to discussing it, we tend to say that Scholar is way stronger in a piece of content than Sage, not that deployment tactics is better than the alternative Sage offers, because, well, it's not like you can pick and choose the tools. And because most of their toolkits are similar enough, only the parts that are really different stand out. We also can sort of assume that balance-wise, any job can beat a duty, and so weaknesses like Scholar being slower at mobility than Sage doesn't matter, since the mechanics have to assume the mobility of whoever slower can make it. Just like the damage of mechanics must surely be balanced around the weaker in that department being able to clear it. But that doesn't change the fact that if we determine that the skills unique to, say, Paladin gives an inherent advantage over Warrior, then Paladin is better in the particular type of duty where that advantage matters at all, even if the two jobs are roughly identical in 90% of other cases. And that is actually often where these weird imbalances come from. You give every DPS roughly the same damage profile and performance, and if one of them does slightly more damage, either literally or by virtue of having a slightly adjusted profile that happens to be advantageous for that fight, suddenly that job stands out as stronger, because all of the DPS jobs had roughly the same options available to them. Give them unique tools, and obviously the jobs that have tools better for proccing will be better for proccing, and so on. But if a category of jobs all have 90% of the same tools, the conversation can come down to a perceived huge imbalance that is actually down to job A has option A, job B has option B, and option A is way better for things than option B, so job B sucks. What is most interesting about these small differences is that as a result of the jobs being so similar, the content that is at such a high difficulty that these small differences matter tend to only be run by players at a skill level where, well, the suggestion that the weaker job, no matter how small the difference is, might be easier is irrelevant, since the content expects you to kinda nail it anyway. And that is how we get back on track with the Sage versus Scholar conversation. Because in my opinion, Sage is the easier to learn and master between the two, thanks in large part to the fact that Zoe and Cardia are possibly the only two actions in the Sage arsenal that can get as complicated as several of Scholar's buttons, whether it be deploy, optimal use of recitation, summon Seraph, Seraphism itself, or even the whole thing with energy drain. So to sort of summarize, is Sage bad? Nah. But because of what Scholar brings to the table, deployment tactics and Seraphism, and the hardest content available, Sage has a harder time. It's quite similar to how Red Mage has a huge advantage over other mages in hard content because it has the raise. So, if you ever wondered why the strongest teams in the world tend to bring a Scholar over a Sage, this would be why. But what do you think? Which healer is your favorite, and why? Have you ever run into a situation in the game where you felt like you had to play a different healer due to the limitations of the one you chose? I would love to hear all about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Shadowbringers, Scholar's pet ability Embrace had a cast time instead of a recast time. It wasn't unheard of to use macros on healing actions like Adloquium and Physic to simultaneously command Eos or Selene to embrace your target at the same time, as, at the time, their logic for who to heal automatically was also not the brightest.